You're listening to the Flex Success podcast, where we teach you how to be less shit.
I'm your co-host Lizzy, and this is Dean. We'll be covering all topics relating to health, fitness, and bodybuilding.
Join us as we use our in-the-trenches experience and up-to-date science to provide you with information that you can actually use.
If you like what we do, be sure to give us a like, follow, share, and tag us on social media.
Welcome back, yet again, everybody, to another Flex Success podcast. We have a returning guest. We have not the entire Flex crew, well, the entire Flex podcast crew in myself, Lizzy, Flex coach George, and an honourable mention to Mr. Joe Jeffery. Mate, welcome back.
Thank you for having me. I don't think I've been on here for a while. Was my last one when I was bald, or have I been on since then? Because that was about, what was that, 5 years ago or something? I must have been on since, surely.
Yeah, no, the first one you were on, you were bald, and you were very, very tanned, I think, from memory.
It was very, George, you remember this. How hot was England during that first COVID wave?
Yeah, probably 21 degrees, and you English folk just have absolutely no tolerance.
I mean, this is my normal skin color with no sun exposure. So a little bit, I go very dark, yeah.
Yeah, so an interesting podcast. But Liz, I almost feel like I need to welcome you back. It's been a while for at least a collective one. You and I have had one each, but a collective one. Welcome to the Cruise podcast.
Oh, thanks, Dean. Good to be back.
What's the personal update, Liz?
My personal update. I've spent the last hour looking into Rio de Janeiro because there's the fucking carnival on this weekend. And I thought, we're in fucking Argentina. We're 3 hours away by a plane. One of the world's coolest street carnivals is on. In a few days, why are we not going? So maybe we'll give you an update on how that went, if it went, in the next podcast. All right, what are we talking about today, Dean?
Well, shall I hit you with the what it is, or really the background of it?
Let's start with the background.
So for anyone, I would say in Australia, but most certainly in Australia and then around the world in the fitness industry, they would have seen that there's been a bit of a fitness industry saga come about recently by a popular Instagram, shall we call him an influencer? I'm not sure. Goob, who is typically responsible for calling out people for photoshopping their photos, for enhancing their physiques artificially, for calling out pedophiles, for making false claims, for ripping people off. He does all the good in the industry, you know? And we all have a laugh. And then it popped up on our page that an ex-client of ours, Hattie Voidal, and her partner, Copen Moore, had gotten into some trouble with the Australian police for the possession of performance-enhancing drugs, allegedly, of course, including some illicit drugs, namely, I think, in the article, and don't quote me on this for certainty, but they were claimed to have been in possession of things like cocaine and MDMA and whatnot. Since then, everybody has obviously come to bat for Hattie, because one of the biggest things was there was some steroids and performance-enhancing drugs in the collection of things that were found on their property. And everyone was saying, "Ha, we knew it. Hattie isn't natty." And that's a sort of a funny little hashtag that's kind of going around. You know, Hattie's not natty. And quite a few people have come to post about it and support Hattie and say, "Look, I think she's natty." She's posted some blood work. And then I've also, personally posted to say I coached her for 60 weeks. There was absolutely nothing to indicate that she wasn't natty. Here's all of the evidence that I have, etc. Anyway, that aside, one of the things that was very surprising to me was how many people were commenting on the fact that illicit drugs were found, and how dare she claim to be some, health and fitness promoter, or somebody who talks about clean health or gut health or whatever it may be. And she also uses these drugs as if to suggest that these drugs were undeniably wrecking health and terrible for you, and that nobody should ever take said drugs. And I thought this might be an interesting discussion for people that I know that are well versed in this space, to discuss whether or not we think illicit drugs have a place potentially in the fitness industry, or is it, one of those things where it's a bit of an oxymoron. You're claiming one thing but doing the other. So here we are.
Okay, here we are. I think a good place to start, like anybody who's done a uni class, is in definitions. And so I think there's two things to unpick here. The first one being like, what do we mean by the health and fitness industry? And actually what we're more specifically talking about is bodybuilding, which I think has some important distinctions from health and fitness, although there's some overlap. And then what we mean by illicit drugs as well. So maybe we'll start with the health and fitness industry. Does anyone have any thoughts there, or should I spill my brain?
Spill away.
Right. So the health and fitness banner is made up of so many different components. You know, we've got like the ketogenic tribe, and we've got CrossFitters, and we've got like people who do ultra marathons, and we've just got people who want to have more energy and general fitness enthusiasts. And we also have bodybuilders. And we know that the aim for bodybuilders is to be as massive and lean as you can to win a competition. And a lot of the time that means taking performance enhancing drugs. And we want to do these things as, you know, in the healthiest possible manner, but the goal isn't health within bodybuilding. So when we say the health and fitness industry, if we really are talking about bodybuilding, we're talking about bodybuilding. We're not really talking about health and fitness only insofar as it supports the bodybuilding goal. And when we talk about what roles do these drugs, we're talking about party drugs here, not performance enhancing drugs, play in that, I think that they might play different roles within health and fitness as they do in bodybuilding. And I'll talk about what I think those differences are later. But yeah, any other thoughts on how bodybuilding might be somewhat separate to the health and fitness industry?
Well, there's something to say about whether competing and getting into the level of stage condition required to be competitive in our sport is healthy by any degree, whether natural or enhanced. Like, it takes quite a considerable amount of stress on the human physiology to achieve that. And there is an important process that we'll go through in doing this to reverse or go through recovery phases out the other side to undo the damage done or potential risk factors leading into that position in time. So straight away, that say that bodybuilding is healthy by any degree is probably a false statement, and that there are safer or healthier ways to approach it, which is, I think, where the two intermingle.
For sure. Yeah, it's almost interesting that it is considered under the banner of health and fitness.
But even similarly, yeah, go for it, Joe.
I think there's even an interesting dichotomy we can start to draw here, and I don't want to get too far ahead, where, I mean, in essence, physique competitions, no matter class or federation, are not contributory towards positive health or fitness outcomes as a whole speaking. I'm sure that there's subsections of activities that you perform within that banner that may be health or fitness promoting, but the whole umbrella of physique development to a competitive level is not health promoting. So we create that dichotomy already between the two. And then when we come to talking about recreational drug use, we can also start to get some significant differences between maybe what health promoting use of pharmacology could be versus harmful. But the strange dichotomy on the ethical question for me here, looking at that comment section, especially from competitive bodybuilders, would often be that PED use is okay with the end goal of physique development because I do it, and so it fits within my bias perfectly. But the right of another individual to alter their own consciousness has a negative ethical connotation that's unacceptable, which is a strange relationship already between the two categories of pharmacology. And I think if we're going to be able to discuss these, if we're ever going to be able to, without getting too philosophical here, as a society, be able to have a balanced and measured discussion about pharmacology, because we are in this kind of pharmacological renaissance, you could say, for lack of a better term right now. We're going to have to move away, at least in my opinion, and I'm nobody, but from molecules having ethics, if you know what I mean. That might sound a bit bizarre, but, you know, this molecule good, this molecule bad, when really it's like no molecule has mechanism of action that could have physiological or neurological ramifications onto the individual. Just look at those things and those cascades or whatever it does, and that doesn't need to fit within a moral hierarchy.
Okay. Yeah, people do this with food, don't they? They're like chocolate bad, carrot good. It's like, well, no, let's graduate from primary school and realize that just like we prescribe a moral value to food, we shouldn't be doing that with drugs either. And that's, I hope by the end of this podcast, the take home message that there's so much gray area and there's some food and people and pharmacologies that can be lethal, or we can use the same thing in different contexts and different dosages, and they can be so helpful and health promoting in people's lives.
Right.
But that's a big can of worms.
There's going to be a sliding scale on that term harm that we use as well, isn't there? And then, I mean, this is where like drug law starts to become really confusing because it has to be precise. You know, if something's going to be legislated, it has to be very precise. So for a drug to be illegal, there has to be a harm, but then the harm to who? Is it the harm to the individual? And what magnitude? Is it to the family or the broader community or the nation? You know, and then how do you separate that out between all of these molecules? And ultimately, who gets to decide? And that's where the difficulty is. Who is the bearer of this information? And is that person allowed to take somebody else's right to alter their consciousness away from them? You know, like America's a good example. You know, you've got the right to bear arms, potentially extremely dangerous. And there
But
are
I don't have the right to end a pregnancy.
that's an example, but you know,
Yeah.
you don't have the right to alter your own consciousness with molecules, which could potentially go very wrong and be harmful. But the autonomy of the individual has to be trusted, right? And I wonder if America will ever go that way. Obviously, it wasn't written.
Marijuana has become legalized now, right? And we have substances that are regulated and legal, like tobacco or alcohol, that have proved to be to result in huge social harms, but also some people use alcohol responsibly as well. And, you know, even some of these illicit drugs that we're talking about, ketamine, MDMA, mushrooms, they've been approved in some places for therapeutic use. Even cocaine. Dean got cocaine shoved up his nose, the one and only time he's had it, during a nose job by a surgeon. So it's not that they're like, and same with performance enhancing drugs, it's not like they're all illegal. They have legal uses and they have like regulated uses. It's just the way that we're talking about them as being something people use without a prescription for the intention of pleasure.
That's
or even therapy.
That raises the interesting question: does legality equal ethics?
Well, it's not illegal to cheat on your partner, is it?
Right. That's a fantastic example, Lizzie. And I think when I was looking through, you know, a lot of the individuals commenting on that original post are Aussies, right? And it's illegal, so these are illicit drugs. I live in England. George lives in England, at least currently. I know he's a man about the world. And I have two insulin pins here, you know, that have anabolics in them, and that's legal. And does that make it good? Obviously not. Legality doesn't reflect an accurate ethical contemplation of these things. But that's it, you know, you use words like illicit. So it's bad.
Yeah.
You know, who gets to decide? I think that's a really tricky question, and one we're going to come up against quite frequently now. In fact, I saw on the news, it might have been last week, the first ever prescription for MDMA has been written.
Oh, cool.
Stuff.
Yeah, it was a photo of the prescription itself. And maps have obviously done some fantastic things changing minds. You know, it's not like we have innate knowledge of the moral law that anabolic steroids are terrible, you know. But there's going to be a shift quite clearly. Like I say, we do appear to be in this kind of renaissance. It'll be interesting to see who gets to decide based on what terms, what is and isn't quote unquote fruitful for the community and the nation at large.
Yeah. Well, my mum has been very sick for a long time with ulcerative colitis. And I remember at a stage when she was at her weakest and not able to get out of bed, the only thing that helped her was steroids. You know, perhaps not at the same dosages or exactly the same stacks as people are taking for bodybuilding, but like and was she wrong to do it? Was that like she should just stayed in bed and maybe died? Like,
ulcerative colitis, there's also prescriptions for medical marijuana in Australia being prescribed for it as well as a treatment for pain symptoms. So, it could have gone down that route to an illicit drug, more illicit drug in the recreational term than what steroids would be. Quite easy could have gone in.
For sure.
Always
Exactly.
make things with Australia and how they perceive steroid, but yet they're kind of one of the first pioneering countries to start using psilocybin in psychiatric treatment now. Like they're prescribing that as opposed to some antidepressants in some people. Not many, but they've kind of taken a bit of a step forward in that direction ahead of some other places around the world. But yet the steroid laws are still very backward.
Yeah, we definitely want to focus in a moment our attention on like what role do these party drugs play in health and fitness. But I want to riff on that a little bit, George, about like the therapeutic use of, what did you say it was? Did you say it was?
Yeah,
Psilocybin.
Right. Okay, but there's also ketamine and MDMA as well. Tell us a bit about what you know about that.
Well, there's been some very good studies done. Obviously, Joe mentioned one of the primary foundations, which was the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, the MAPS Foundation, that started to lead quite a lot of the research in, I believe MDMA was like the last 30 years, like three
Since
decades?
the 70s.
Yeah, since the 70s. From the
36 years this year of work.
Yeah, since they started looking into MDMA. They're also some of the leading pioneers for all of the LSD research in like Switzerland. There's other places like the Johns Hopkins University that in the UK that started to pump out a lot of good studies into psychedelics. And what it's starting to increasingly come out is that as a broad spectrum overview for this class of drugs is that there seems to be positive benefits in things like brain degradation, so potential treatment for Alzheimer's and dementia, for treatment of anti-anxiety, so to replace potential medications that we currently have in pharmacological practice now that we know come with negatives, also treatments of antidepressants to kind of outweigh antidepressants, things like SSRIs. And obviously, we can start to dive into the mechanism of action of why they potentially could be beneficial or why they seem to show that premise. I think Joe will bounce off this one a little bit, quite a bit in a minute. Now, psilocybin was one that's always interested me because it's a drug that I've experimented with personally through the years of my life for different reasons, whether therapeutic or just for out of curiosity. And the thing that always intrigued me was the kind of nootropic effect of psilocybin, which also seemed to lead into some of its therapeutic benefits in treatment of psychiatric disorders, which potentially lead down the route of improvements in neuroplasticity, which would be interactions of generation of new neurons, also improvements in synapse pathways, so improving strength of synapse, which then led to better recollection of learning and memory recall. Then also that semi-linked back to increases in brain derived nootropic factor, so BDNF, which was where they seem to think the MOA is essentially driving these kind of cascade of effects in the brain. But the problem with SSRIs, the drugs that they're kind of taking out of play, is that there seems to be a heap of negatives consequentially to long-term use, which don't seem to be as apparent with the use of things like psilocybin or ketamine to replace them. So there's a better option for a similar problem they're trying to fix.
Yeah, so as George mentioned there, the neuroplasticity element is what people are most interested in, it seems, when it comes to psilocybin. We've essentially got a broad group of psychedelics that mimic endogenous neurotransmitters. So in the example of psilocybin, you've got primary excuse the dog shaking, HT2A agonist activity. There's some other serotonin receptor activity. I believe there's 13 total serotonin and HT receptors. And a lot of the anti-aging crowd are tapping into this now as well, because as George mentioned, the BDNF and NGF increases what those people are very interested in. Hence the popularity of things like lion's mane for the same reason, or Semax or Salank, these Russian peptides that people use specifically for nootropic benefit. It is that neuroplasticity or neurogenic input. Ketamine, again, has been studied for not the same input, but has very clinical statistical significance, particularly for PTSD, depression, and anxiety. Ketamine is essentially an NMDA receptor antagonist, so it can block glutamate binding to the NMDA receptor pretty heavily, and that's going to cause an upregulation of AMPA receptor action, further cascade down other neurons, which is going to drive neuroplasticity. And basically, when we talk about neuroplasticity, we're talking about creating the correct positive conditions for change, hence anxiety conditions, PTSD conditions, when paired with a therapeutic setting. The rewiring, for lack of a better word, that's not very scientifically literate, but I think it's probably the best way to explain it, of neural pathways to replace them in a one way you're not stuck in a loop of these issues that you're having. And MDMA has been through tons of research now, 1,700 human subjects in total, one adverse event. So widely studied phase 3 clinical trials, I think was 2021, if I remember correctly. PTSD, eating disorders, anxiety disorders, autism, and also quite a broad amount of data on healthy individuals with no disorders. So a pretty robust data set for MDMA, especially, and it's not a classical psychedelic, but was out of all of the psychedelics, likely the most robust amount of data behind MDMA.
Yeah. I mean, it reduces defensiveness and blame and ego and judgment. And I think it can help people feel connected and have empathy and just access memories and feelings that when they're sober, it's just too painful to process and get over. And I think it was you, Joe, you mentioned before Changing Your Mind, which for those who don't know is a Netflix doco on, there's an episode for MDMA, another one for mushrooms. And there's some really good examples there. Well, it actually goes through the research of the therapeutic uses of these various drugs, if anybody wants to go and have a listen. And, we all know Netflix is the most valid source of scientific information, but it really is a good series.
There was a good reference I heard back to looking at trauma, referring to it like an abscess and thinking like a physical abscess in the body, the way the body creates this protective shell around it to stop the infection from spreading everywhere. And if we break the abscess, we know that it's going to cause a lot of problems in the body. You can think of trauma in that same way, that the body creates like this shell around it, and it's like a protective mechanism against it. So when the sober mind or the person with PTSD tries to break through this, it's a very painful and traumatic experience, and the defense mechanism, the survival mechanism to reboot against that is quite tough to break. But with these drugs like MDMA, that, like Liz said, the decreased defensiveness allow for broadening of like the conscious mind and the ability to potentially separate yourself from your subconscious and conscious thought. And that feeling of empathy allows you to then break through the shell of the trauma and talk about it in a way that's not with the defense mechanism up on its heightened horses trying to fight back against you.
I think this brings us on to an interesting moral question that's probably more pertinent to the case at hand. So somebody listening that is maybe more conservative when it comes to, I hate to use that word because I'd probably label myself conservative, but anyway, when it comes to recreational drug use, psychedelic use, whatever we want to say, we say, yeah, but Hattie hasn't got PTSD or an eating disorder, who knows, or anxiety disorder or autism, as far as we know.
She's doing it for fun.
But she's doing it. So, this to me is interesting. Again, we've got another moral dichotomy. It's okay. So let me use myself as an example. Chronic migraine sufferer for years since I was very young. I'm prescribed tramadol. Got a lot of it here. I'm supposed to use this every day. Although I don't. Yes. Although I maybe only like once. I only use it if I'm can't do anything, which is normally like
probably a good idea.
Yeah. Right, I've got some nerve damage in the occipital region back here, and it gets inflamed, and I have to use pain relief. Tramadol is the only thing that seems to do a good job. So tramadol is an opiate. It's not only an opiate, it's also an SNRI, serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor. So it keeps serotonin in the brain for longer, keeps norepinephrine or noradrenaline, I should say, for you UK, EU listeners. So it has opiate effects, which feels great. Anybody that's used opiates. Serotonergic effects, the effects of serotonin, feels great. And noradrenaline, very stimulating, mood uplifting. I promise you, that feels fantastic. Now, if I take that for my migraine, that's good. The doctor gave it to me, right? If it's a Sunday, I'm chilling, I've got nothing to do, I'd like to get high today. and I take it.
Mhm.
Why is that a problem? Okay,
All of
so
a sudden, yeah.
yeah, this is the moral quandary that I wonder about this.
Mm.
Why is that a problem?
But Joe, it would be
I
okay if you just got plastered drunk because it's a legal substance on a Sunday, just because you've got nothing to do and you want to.
Right. Well, it's a problem when harm results, I would say, on other people. And the argument comes, well, your wife would suffer, you can't look after your dogs properly, your family's going to crumble and whatnot. Believe me, plenty of people in society exist that are recreational drug users multiple times a week that do not lose their. And I think it might have been Dr. Carl Hart that spoke about this first. I might be wrong. I know that you've both read the book, so if I'm quoting this incorrectly, please do correct me. That basically
Mhm.
you're considered an addict or whatever terminology you use when you're unable to keep up with your responsibilities.
Mhm.
So I guess that's where the moral line's drawn, but that's clearly not where we're drawing this moral line with Hattie.
Right. So
no,
people are just shitting on her for using it at all, saying that, like, how can you preach health when you take these drugs? And then the underlying kind of like what they're insinuating there is that it's bad for health. Well, I guess the burden of evidence relies on the person making the claim. So where is the evidence that occasional recreational use of things like MDMA or cocaine or something like that for people even without conditions like anxiety disorders, PTSD, depression? Show me
mm,
Yeah.
where it says that it is harmful. And I would argue that actually, if we're going to talk about bodybuilding specifically, and there's some nuances here definitely worth discussing, that it actually would add to a healthier life, to a balanced, healthier lifestyle, because we know that bodybuilding can be quite lonely. They, especially in comp prep, calories are limited, hunger is high, they can't go out drinking like maybe they might be able to do occasionally in the off season. So that further limits their social interaction. But maybe if they take a little bit of MDMA as a social lubricant when they're out at a party and they can open up and enjoy themselves more and connect with their friends, and they don't wake up the next day hungover, they don't have to spend the whole day's calories on alcohol or be there starving and a little bit anxious and not really enjoying themselves. Like, isn't part of health connecting with other people and being out and social and bonding? And if these drugs can help, maybe the people that are very much against it don't understand these drugs and perceive them in a way that the media has shown it, like you just passed out on the floor or something like that. But anybody
mm,
with a bit of experience with these drugs will know that it's actually not like that at all.
yeah.
You'll
Well,
make a best friend in an instant. Go on,
I
Dean.
was going to say, Liz, I think but to Joe's question of like, why is it okay in this instance, but not in this one? I think
Right.
that's probably because there's and well, an uninformed for one, and then a reductionist sort of disconnect between the two different actions and thinking that they're very different. So, in instance number one, Joe is decreasing what is perceived to be a negative symptom with a medication, whereas
Okay.
number two is he's increasing an uplifting symptom by choice. And
Mm-hmm.
then there's a disconnect between the medication being only something that helps fix problems, but the same action or the same mechanism of action. People hear the word, the terminology MOA. I know that's been thrown around a couple of times. MOA is the same, but just used from a recreational one to uplift the symptom. For some reason, I think where the disconnect is that people assume that it is causing untoward, you know, uh, you know, not irrefutable, even though we know it's not, and like unable to be fixed negative damage.
Mm.
That's where I think there is a huge disconnect.
Yeah, you also have the additional kind of we've got these rings, right? So you've got Hattie here. I mean, I'm Hattie, if you're watching, I'm sorry, I'm just using you as an example, individual that uses recreational drugs or performance enhancing drugs here. Then you've got the wider spectrum of her boyfriend or her family or whatever. Then you've got her community. And then because she is so influential, you've got the whole of Instagram, social media world out here. So the argument could be made, well, what she does, ripples out to these people. But in reality, she is not on Instagram telling people to do these things. She's not even saying this is what I personally do. And I'm not saying that she does or does not. I mean, just use me as an example, then fuck it. I use recreational drugs or whatever. I in my own home, in my own time, and keep up with my work responsibilities or whatever. But who does where does the harm ripple? If you get what I'm saying, it doesn't
Yeah.
reach out. So what? Why is this? Police found X drug in Hattie's house. Well, who is that harmful for? I would say at the most you could make an argument for her, but then why is her personal autonomy not considered? Because we have no right to say, you could argue legislative right wise there, you don't have a right to do this or do that. My political standpoint wouldn't agree with that, right? It might with yours or that of Australia or whatever. But we as individuals, as like these moral harbingers onto Hattie, you shouldn't do that. It doesn't mold with the health and fitness. Well, maybe I am not the health and fitness industry. I just made my own conscious decision to do something in my own time and didn't tell anybody about it. Why is it problematic?
Yeah. I mean, she's
Well, the other
really
thing too,
being
yeah.
bullied from absolutely everyone on the internet, which is devastating to see. But also, like, as you mentioned, Joe, unfair, because what she does, why is that anybody else's problem?
Yeah, and the slew of comments on there. It reminds me, I mentioned this phrase to you, Liz, like, he without sin may cast the first stone, which is a biblical quote, but I think is pretty adept here. How many people on this comment section are, using the biblical terms if we link it to that, they are like present of sin, you could say, for exactly of what they're talking about. This is unhealthy and bad. Do these individuals vape or drink, or do they speed? Do you ever go over the speed limit?
Do you go to bed late? Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, there's cigarette smoking, alcohol drinking, competitive bodybuilders that do partake in things that are absolutely and unquestionably going to have an effect that may be negative, but whether it be acutely or chronically, depending on their level of use. And for some reason, there's, I think, just a huge disconnect between the illicit substances being these significantly worse ingredients. I also think you brought up that point before, Joe. It's important for people to recognize and remember that they are not fully aware of somebody's previous or current life. Like, there are probably no individuals outside your circle, Joe, that are aware of the headaches that you experience. Similarly, there are probably things that Hattie deals with that nobody knows about. And although we can never say, hey, because it's being used in therapeutic use, therefore it's fine to use personally for the same thing. That's not what we're suggesting. But people seek things for their own benefits, and we sometimes don't know why. So maybe don't judge the book by its cover.
Yeah, I just think it's too much of a simple mindset that people are like, well, it's a class 1 drug. Like, okay, well, I'm going to go smoke 10 packets of cigarettes a day because it's legal. Like, it's just a ridiculous way to define good and bad.
Especially in the bodybuilding space, when we look at the difference in the argument between, it's okay to spend some calories or discretionary calories on alcohol as a problem. Well, as an enhanced bodybuilder, I challenge you to really reconsider, because that's going to cost you more deleterious health consequences in the medium to long term than what using some rec drugs will. There are much safer options within the rec space to have a good time that are going to cost you far less health consequences than having a few drinks in the reality of what these drugs do when you look internally.
Yeah. I mean, of course, we're not saying that everybody should just go take a ton of party drugs, nor are we ignoring the fact that some people have a problem with recreational drugs and they can't keep up with their responsibilities, and then maybe we would call them addicts. I don't know, depending on your definition. And yes, Joe, I think I remember that was Carl Hart's definition of an addict, somebody who can't keep up with their responsibilities. But that's not who we're talking about here. We're talking about people who can take drugs like adults, or like grown-ups is the name of that book, isn't it? Drugs Like Grown-ups by Dr. Carl Hart. Yeah.
Guys, I'm bursting for a pee. I'll be 1 minute.
Oh, go. You go.
Sorry, I just trained legs and drank like 2 liters of water and immediately sat down.
You are excused. I want to look at this question. Could we think of party drugs, MDMA, cocaine, ketamine, as performance enhancing? Because we have the evidence leads us to believe that Hattie is not taking performance-enhancing drugs based off everything we know, including over 1 year of coaching within Flex Success, because she was Dean's client. but could MDMA, for example, which, you know, gives you more energy, so it's easier to move around, it suppresses your appetite, so it's easier to eat less. Could that be performance enhancing if we're talking about bodybuilders who, at the pointy end of a comp prep, need to move more and eat less, and it's so hard to do that, and these drugs are making it easier?
Perhaps not by that definition,
Okay.
but there are some very good ways to approach this. And something that I used on the back end of mine was the depletion of serotoninergic and dopaminergic receptors in the brain. You know, when your food's really low, those systems in the brain regulated by adenosine triphosphate, carbohydrates, you're low on carbs. It's hard to regulate your emotions when your carbs get that low. Well, there's some interesting research on MDMA that actually shows longer term improvement in serotonin production just from one microdose on the scale of four to 6 weeks. I'm sure Joe jump in and correct me if I'm wrong on that, but about 4 weeks of improvement in serotonin production off of a microdose of MDMA. So towards the back end of comp prep, when those things are in the gutter from low carbs, potentially that could help with your mood, which would then have a positive impact, especially on the relationships and the people around you that typically
your training, your sleep.
Yep, everything would then improve, which could potentially be an enhancement for the end of prep. But I don't think by like our traditional definition of performance enhancing, like MDMA specifically.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Well,
so Joe, what we're talking about is could party drugs be considered performance enhancing?
It's hard to draw a definition on performance enhancing. I
Like
think,
caffeine.
yeah, well, precisely. That's a psychoactive chemical.
Water, because if you're dehydrated, your performance goes down. If we're talking about gym
I think
performance, so is water a drug?
touch on a bit of what George was mentioning there. If we look at the whole system between, and I'll simplify this maximally, but serotonergic action, so serotonin receptor, dopamine receptor, you've got GABA, glutamate. These are all neurotransmitters that are going to reflect not only how good you feel, but how you sleep, your basal anxiety, your relationship with others, your libido, potentially your performance. You know, we see in studies on individuals that have minor increases in dopamine. Actually, funnily, maximal elevations in dopamine don't seem to do this, but improved performance, improved working memory. So if you're on a contest prep and you still have to keep up with your check-ins and whatnot, which you do, which Dean was always excellent at doing, despite getting absolutely dick-skin peeled, you know, and we've got such a wide variety of molecules now. If anybody's ever spent any time on like the Reddit research chemicals page, and you go on like serotonergic drug list, there's 100 and however many different molecules on there that act exactly like MDMA that are out of classification. And then you go down the line of nootropics, things like bromontane that upregulate tyrosine hydroxylase that ends up as L-dopa, that ends up as dopamine. So now, you know, you've got more dopamine through the day, and, you know, appetite regulation comes into play, and, you know, all of these different things. Yes, certainly these molecules could be used recreationally and by almost secondary characteristic improve your physique outcome or performance outcome. I know so many people in prep that party maybe once a month, you know, you could say. And it's just one night to be silly, relax, not be hungry, be social, because those things are very difficult when you're in the depths of prep. And it gives you something such as an afterglow effect that would last, you know. So in those ways, it's almost becoming a discussion about, you know, autonomic nervous system regulation long term.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And maybe the question also comes down to, so, you know, we're talking there about like, you know, is it performance enhancing? It might also come down to, let's say somebody's competing in a tested federation. Maybe those particular substances aren't banned, like an illegal substance in that federation, but we need to also maybe discuss like the spirit of, because maybe there's some things that you can take to suppress your appetite that aren't banned, but, you know, in the spirit of performance enhancing, maybe it should not be within your moral compass. But, you know, that's so subjective and such a sliding scale. So maybe one with too much gray to really come to any real conclusions on.
I think definitions there become almost impossible with the amount of development in the creation of new molecules constantly. And then again, who gets to decide what is and isn't allowed? I think you have to be really, really precise. You end up with things like yohimbine being on. I mean, I've just written an ebook on yohimbine. If anybody's watching, it's coming out next week. And it has pretty robust effects on fat loss, on lipolysis, more so than some real PDs do, you know?
Mm.
So it, I think all of this comes back down to this moral question, you know, where, and I don't think anybody can do it. How we separate good from bad across all molecules. I don't think it can happen.
Mm.
And assuming that people listening, and Dean and George as well, agree with that there's too much gray area to say this is good or this is bad, we can only conclude that it's absolutely ludicrous that everyone's pointing the finger at Hattie and being like, you're unhealthy. How can you claim, you know, or promote a healthy lifestyle and a balanced lifestyle and take these illegal drugs? That's just so simple-minded. It's simplifying something to the point of not even being true.
Yeah, and some of the greats in this space, like how heavily published is Hart, you know, the aforementioned Dr. Hart, probably the most published researcher in psychoactive drugs ever. He'd have something to say about that. Rick Doblin, the founder of MAPS, he sure wouldn't agree with that. People far more educated than individual commenting on Instagram would see that and think it was juvenile.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you think it's primarily stemmed out of like fear of negative and a misunderstanding though? Because like, you know, I don't think like we're never going to be able to answer the moral conundrum of whether or not particular drugs are good and or bad, or who should be able to use them or not. But what we can maybe do for individuals, like we do even in the bodybuilding space, which we know is not health centric, that goal of getting completely peeled, is give people the opportunity to make informed choices around their decision making process. And a lot of people are probably going to be sitting here listening, going, okay, like this all sounds great, but like surely there are some negatives with the use of MDMA and the use of cocaine or the use of ketamine or whatever it may be. And they may just assume that there's only negatives. Maybe they don't know about the positives. Is that something maybe we should unpick? Some molecule specific concerns that someone may have, like, you know, the overuse of an amphetamine based stimulant for a large male who may or may not have heart problems using steroids, probably something they should consider. You know, versus the MDMA on the weekend once every 4 or 5 weeks to whatever degree of use.
I think you've touched on a few great points there. And sorry, I don't want to butt in if anybody else was going to speak there.
Not at all.
The first thing you said about where does that come from? And I mean this with no ill will. I just think this to be true. I think it comes from intellectual arrogance. And what I mean by that is the individual commenting thinks that they know something for sure. So they're so sure of the comment when they don't understand comprehensively what they are saying. And that isn't necessarily their fault because they haven't been presented data. And this was the goal of Physique Collective as a whole. If anybody listening doesn't know, I run an app called Physique Collective, which 90% of is pharmacology discussion around performance enhancing use, where we essentially have no recommendation-based outcome on there, or this is good or bad, or you should do this or shouldn't do that. It's about presenting as up to date as possible evidence-based information alongside some anecdotes, and you as a rational adult can make your own decision on what you do with that information. And I certainly wouldn't want anybody listening to this to think that these drugs aren't without consequence. All of the drugs that we've mentioned absolutely have consequences and adverse events if used improperly or if by the wrong individual. Even something as apparently innocuous as THC, if used by the wrong individuals, the data seems to indicate any individual with pre-withstanding anxiety condition seems to be the most common adverse event in THC users, where they'll get depersonalization or derealization disorder or some form of HPPD, which arguably does or doesn't exist. The literature's mixed on that. And, you know, things like this. Certainly that happens. We need to be aware of that. But these clinical trials, especially on MDMA, have shown that that's extremely rare when you're working within these specific frameworks. For example, I believe MDMA is something like 1.5 milligram per kilogram of body weight, followed by 0.75 milligram per kilogram of body weight. I think they actually changed that. They don't use a milligram per kilogram anymore. I think they just do either 120 milligram with 60 milligram 90 minutes later, or 150 milligrams followed by 75 milligrams an hour and
Sorry,
a
which
half
drug is
later.
this?
MDMA.
Oh, yeah, right, okay.
Yes. So
Yeah.
out of 1,700 human subjects, there was only one adverse event. So, we can look at that with an evidence-based eye and say, if I do that in the right setting, there's a very high likelihood that I'm going to be okay. And that's the way that we need to approach this. But if I do 500 milligrams and then 250 milligram, and then top it off with a few lines of Coke on it, and don't drink anything because I'm at a rave and I can't be bothered to queue to get to the bar, and I've already got an echocardiogram showing an ejection fraction of 10, yeah,
You're gonna have
the exponentially increases.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, and I think that statistics should guide all of our choices. Even people like, oh my God, I can't believe you've done skydiving. It's so dangerous. I was like, oh my God, I can't believe you got in a car. Like, statistically speaking, you're more likely to die in a car crash than out of a plane. You're more likely to get into a fight when you're in a place where lots of people are drinking, as opposed to people taking recreational drugs. Like, we should be looking at the statistics and like how much is considered a safe dose, and for sure. Yeah.
But also, Liz, like you alluded to earlier, it's like what is a health positive outcome? Because if we looked at the totality of the negatives associated with the PED using male, for example, who's competing in a bodybuilding show, they're progressively getting unhealthier as the time progresses, because the drug load usually goes up, the body fat goes down, the recovery capacity goes down, the sleep deprivation goes up, the mood decrease goes,
steroid drugs, right?
Yeah, like the mood becomes progressively worse and shorter, and all of these things happen. And if we were to say, like, all right, how do we define health? All right, so there's some physiological considerations which we know we're pushing in towards a negative direction. There's some psychological considerations which are also typically shifting somewhat negative, maybe outside of motivation and goal setting and all that kind of jazz. And then there's the social considerations, and you're probably becoming more and more of a recluse. So the action of being a bodybuilder is quite legitimately sending you in the opposite direction of being health centric. But there may be the opportunity for you, and you mentioned this briefly earlier too, Liz, to step aside for a second. And Joe, you said this too, once a month or once every 2 months, whatever it may be, you have a little dabble in something that is ego dissolving for a moment, like MDMA. It's connectivity driving. So like all of a sudden now you're back into relationships you otherwise didn't have. Stress relieving to the point that the ego dissolution and all that kind of stuff. Like, this illicit substance that may otherwise be considered a negative has actually just moved me further away from the negative health outcomes that I'm specifically driving every week as a prep client. But most people only want to think about the physical and fear the physical, I think.
Yeah, you remind me of something else worth mentioning, that androgen users aren't necessarily aware of the psychoactive isn't the right word, neurological impacts of their drug use also. They look at recreational drugs like, let's say, like psilocybin, like George mentioned, a drug that has neurological action at the HT2A receptor. It's an agonist there, and it creates these crazy effects to sounds and sights and whatnot. But your anabolic steroids, they don't only bind and transcribe effects in muscle tissue. There are effects on the brain as well. And we're very early days on this data. I'm trying my hardest to stay up to date and pass out what little information we've got. It seems, and no, if somebody watching for 10 years and this is wrong, please don't have me on this, but it seems that these are like excessive glutamate modulated, and we're seeing downregulation of GABA action and some desensitization of dopamine receptor action. So and we actually see estrogen, funnily enough, which would kind of make sense given we already know that it's neuroprotective and neurogenerative to upregulate GABA receptor action to clear glutamate. I don't know if it has effects on resensitizing dopamine receptors or whatnot. But anyway, that's besides the point. My point here is that these have neurological impacts and these are used and okay or necessary. So to attack another person for using a molecule that has neurological impacts also would be a little bit ironic, but it's not necessarily the fault of the individual that doesn't know this. And also some of these drugs may help in those things. You know, NMDA receptor antagonists like clenbuterol, Jesus, like ketamine, most definitely if you've got issues with glutamate, that's going to be helpful, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Gosh, I forget the name of the book now. I'll put it in the show notes. I was reading a book about people who do extreme things, cave diving, and I don't know, what's it called when you jump off a cliff, not with a parachute, but with that like bodysuit?
Jumping.
What is it?
Base jumping.
Base jumping, stuff like that. And it was written, what's it called?
Jump with the squirrel suits.
Yeah, that's the one. So each chapter is dedicated to somebody at the top of their game at some sort of extreme sport. And it was written by an Australian doctor who's a cave diver. And he actually was the guy at the head of the rescue of, you know, there was a soccer team of Thai children, boys, and they got trapped in a cave. And the cave flooded, and for like 2 weeks, they couldn't get out. They couldn't get food to them. Do you guys remember this? The Thai cave
Yeah, I do.
rescue?
I do.
Yeah, so the doctor that was in charge of that rescue, he wrote the book and he used ketamine to sedate the boys while they were, because it took, I think, 3 hours. The boys had to be calm enough underwater. None of them had any scuba diving experience. And the boys just would have had so much anxiety that their oxygen tanks would have run out and they would have died. So they sedated the boys with ketamine, and nobody batted an eyelid. Everyone's like, this is amazing that you found a solution. Pump the little boys full of ketamine. Yay. And I just thought that was such a bizarre kind of example of how people accept a particular drug in one circumstance and would lose their minds if someone did it on the couch on a Saturday night for pleasure or for something else. I personally am going to do more mushrooms soon to help me learn Spanish. And I wonder how much that would be frowned upon, because I'm not doing it for PTSD or for depression or for anxiety. I'm doing it to help me, you know, learn something. And I wonder if people sitting back go, oh, that's great. Like, you're doing it for a good reason, but why isn't a good reason? Because I want to have fun with my friends on a Saturday night.
Yeah, I think things are changing. If you go on Reddit and go to the microdosing subreddit, there's tens of thousands of people on there. I will say the clinical literature on microdosing is pretty poor. I'd say it doesn't look like it does much of anything, but the anecdotes are strong. The clinical data to support macro dosing is very good. But people are getting substantial improvements in their quality of life from microdosing psilocybin and LSD.
I can attest to trial in both of those.
Well,
Would anyone ever try heroin?
Sorry?
Would anyone try heroin?
No.
That's not me. I've seen too many reports of RB find issues in that once. I mean, opiates are admittedly, I'll be candid, are my vice, and I can get too. I have to limit my opiate exposure. But again, here's an example of some harm reduction practice. I know rationally that if I use opiates maybe more than 4 days per week, that I start to make excuses to myself. And I've been in this position before where, I've got a bit of a cold, I'll do that, and I've got these steps to do, so that would help that. And pretty quickly you can convince yourself quite easily. But you can also be an adult about it and say, I'm just going to do this twice per week,
Yeah.
And thankfully for you, you live in an environment that is conducive to you supporting these decisions or supporting these thoughts with, positive decisions. Whereas an individual who's having a shit time every day is likely going to find it far more difficult, which is one of the big arguments, again, to mention his name, of Dr. Carl Hart, and the likelihood of, repeat use of drugs and addiction and falling back into it and whatnot. But the funny thing is, Liz, you said mushrooms before. I think you'd actually noticed there that the whole naturalistic fallacy. They'd be like, yeah, but it's a mushroom, it's fine. You're like, oh, I'm going to microdose MDMA then. And that was cooked in a kitchen. Like, oh, you can't do that.
It's bad. bad for you. Hey, so who else has read this book, Drugs for Grown-Ups? I know you have, Joe, because me and you went back and forth like a book club. Anyways, it was a while ago, maybe a couple of years ago, that I read this book. So Dean, you just mentioned that, you know, people who are in bad situations are more likely to justify heavy use and continued use when maybe they shouldn't, whereas Joe is kind of in a situation where he can regulate himself more easily. So in the book, Drugs for Grown-Ups, he looked at the statistics of people who were once addicted to I think it was opiate use, wasn't it, Joe, if you remember? And they were using it while they were in the army, and they were just bored, nothing was happening, and they were getting high.
Yeah, this is an opium, yeah.
And when they came back home, it was fairly easy for them to stop using it because they were just in a different environment, and in an environment where they weren't kind of having these triggers to use the drug. Whereas people who had an addiction would go to rehabilitation, everything was looking fine, and then they'd go back home to the exact same environment with the exact same problems, with, you know, inadequate coping mechanisms, and they'd get back on the drugs. Am I remembering this correctly, Joe?
Yeah, that's one example. Another example is some of the rodent studies done with cocaine, where
they put them in the right environment.
Right, yeah. So it's going to depend on what they have available in their cage will reflect their use of the cocaine. So the rodents that have nothing to do chronically use cocaine until they die, and the rodents that have jobs to do or maybe a little wheel to run on, they either cease use entirely or rather infrequently use. Sorry.
Yeah, they put them in. They put them into like a rodent dream world essentially. I can't remember how it was explained. Like rodent happy land was the sort of thing.
Disneyland or something.
They just didn't do it. And then Dr. Carl Hart also, I think, references. I don't remember the specific states within America, but where the largest effect that opiates have had, especially prescription opiates, on the American sort of subcultures, where there's been huge reductions in job availability, like when there was a massive crash in the car industry in Detroit. And I can't remember some of the other ones. Yeah, so those areas whereby the environment was completely turned upside down, which were seemingly and similarly the same places where the opiate addictions rose quite significantly. But yeah, it's an interesting discussion. I think obviously the problem is that not everybody can, you know, jump into the research as well as Joe and George do and read through it and understand mechanisms of action, and they can decide whether or not their fear is valid or not. But I think similarly, because you can't do that, you probably shouldn't form such strong opinions on the ethical and or even like physical considerations for use. But rather, like I really wanted this podcast to be like an opportunity for people just to take a moment and think, maybe I've judged the use of these things just far too quickly. And perhaps given that there is now like at least a medical recognition that some of these are incredibly effective beyond already well-established, frequently used medications that are seemingly not doing what they claim to in the grand scheme of things, like SSRIs and all the rest of it, that maybe there actually might be something behind these guys being used more frequently.
Most definitely.
Yeah. Maybe that's a good place to wrap it up and begin our segments. First one being a less shit tip. If there was like a take-home point or a tip that we might want to leave with our audience.
Practical
recommendation. Less shit.
Milligrams on a night out.
Yeah, don't mix.
Take loads of drugs.
How to drive maximum synergy.
Yeah. Polypharmacy model, rec drugs.
I think it might be, unless you have the resources to form strong opinions, like the ability to actually read and interpret research, or people in your corner who you can trust and actually give you a balanced opinion. Maybe don't form the strong opinions in the first place, kind of just pulling on that thread from Dean. Might be the less shit tip, or even if you formed an opinion based on what the media has told you about something, maybe it's not the full picture.
Don't be so to not be able to hear a different opinion and perhaps change your own. Always listen.
I can add on to that. Maybe my be less shit tip would be, so if you do change your opinion and you're interested in these molecules and altering your consciousness, not to sound too holistic or homeopathic on this one. We live in a beautiful time in history, a unique time where we can go online and have open, free access to so much information. You could, let's say you get interested in MDMA, since that's been a heavy topic of information. You can go and read a huge collation of articles on exactly what this drug does neurologically, who's used it, at what doses, in what setting, at what age, what milligram, what duration of time, what the perceived effects were, what the physiological effects were, with follow-ups, months and years afterwards. You can go and look at that and get a pretty good idea. If you do decide to do it, you can make a very informed decision on that. And we've never been in that position before to have as much robust evidence as that. So that maybe that
you can even go and get your pills tested to make sure that it's not going to kill you.
Yes, drug
Get
state
a pill testing kit
is the one where you can look at accounts of other pills, or you can even send yours in or get sent out. I believe, what are the strips called? You apply the solution to the drug that you've got, and it will display a certain color or whatnot. But yeah, we have access to all of these things.
Not good for me. They'd tell me it's purple, I'd think it's blue, and then I wouldn't know what I'm taking.
Colorblind boy over here.
All colors are good colors. That's what I've figured out since trying mushrooms in my life. My tip would be, if you are going to enter into discussion or potential discovery of these things, would be to enter it first with an inquisitive mindset as opposed to one of judgment or a closed nature. Because I used to be the closed off, uncertain, hyper judgmental, my way's the highway kind of person when I was younger, and just so hell bent on being the best possible version of me from an athletic standpoint. And what I learned very quickly when I was subjected to people with more open minds and better critical thinking skills around these things, that when I enter it with an inquisitive mindset, I generally find answers that are or information that is less biased towards my already cognitive bias. So do that.
Yeah. Can I tell the story of your first time trying drugs, Dean?
It's poisoned you.
I don't think it's particularly that is an exciting one, but sure.
I think it's interesting. So I was going, I started quite young, and me and Dean got together, like, I don't know, at the age of 26, no, 25, something like that. And Dean didn't come with me to this 3-day music festival because it wasn't his scene. And he didn't want to be, the sober boyfriend following around the high girlfriend. And I went just with
and because I was a fucking bodybuilder.
And everyone would stare at you. Yeah, it would literally legitimately did add to the equation though, because you don't love to be stared at. And the girl that I was with was single at the time and decided that every man she saw she wanted to make out with, which wasn't the most fun for me because I would have to just like stand back and hold her handbag while she went from guy to guy. And I was like, well, I kind of want to be here to party with someone. Anyways, because it was more than a 1-day event, on the second day, I think it was, I was going in and the security guard was standing there putting wristbands on people, and she dropped them on the ground. And I said, oh, here, let me help you pick them up. And so I put my backpack also on the ground, helped her collect them and gave them to her. But what I did is I put my backpack strategically on one of the armbands. So when I picked my backpack up, I was like, haha, now I have an extra armband. And I came home the second day and I was like, Dean, please come with me to the third day. Like, it would be so much fun if you were there, and blah, blah, blah. And you were actually helping me braid drugs into my hair, weren't you? Because it's further away from the sniffer dogs. And yes, you realize. And it was a lot of begging, and I didn't think that he actually would. But eventually Dean came with me on the third day, took a photo of enormous pupils in the bathroom and sent it to his brother, who's dabbled from the age of about 7 years old.
Send it to my little brother. Yeah.
Yeah. And it was like, I forget what you said to him, but he was so shocked.
I just wrote, hey, bro, and he was like, no fucking way. And I was like, oh, yeah, apparently.
He wasn't there.
He would have been gutted. But I'm just so pleased that that my begging worked. And Dean had an open enough mind to do something that previously he just thought were for, I don't know, for addicts or people that didn't take training seriously or whatever it was that he thought. And it's opened us up to some really cool experiences since that. at least, what, 6 years ago or something, more than that, 8 years
Can I?
ago.
I just saw a quick adjunct to this that just made me think of it too. One of the problems with the negative association with these sorts of drugs as well, especially in the athlete world, is that it is in the past forced athletes of tested sports who just want to let their hair down, who are allowed to drink, might I add, to go and actually do things that are likely far worse for them in an effort to try and have a moment of relaxation and calmness and social interaction and stuff like that. Like there was a huge period in the Australian Rugby League sort of sport where they were like mixing uppers with downers. So we had guys like, like trying to take sleeping medication while stacking it with excessive caffeine use to try and get them into some sort of like sense of euphoria, because they knew if they just did some cocaine or some whatever it may be, that they would pop for it because it's an illegal drug in their sport. So like I think sometimes again this closed-minded sort of approach can actually push us closer towards damage and problems than it can if we have an open discussion around like what are the pros and cons of these things. How can they be used at least somewhat safer than what they would be? Obviously not safely, but safer. But yeah. So yeah,
it's a really good point.
What do we got next, Liz? Something we're sharing. I think we've already shared that book fantastically. Definitely Dr. Carl Hart's Drugs for Grown-Ups is an interesting read. It's probably a little bit more towards the political discussion than it is towards the actual how to take drugs as a grown-ups discussion, but still definitely some interesting discussion in there. And then the other one you boys mentioned as well was Maps. I think that's a great one. And then Liz, you mentioned what's the Netflix one with the 4-part series?
How to Change Your Mind.
How to Change Your Mind. Yeah. That was pretty good.
Yeah. All right. So instead of a would you rather, George had an idea to ask us all a very fun question. Go on, George.
So if you could choose any one drug to do for the rest of your life, specifically in the party field space, guys, come on, don't be bored and choose steroids.
Not caffeine or something.
Something boring. Something fun. Any drug, any one drug that you can only do that for the rest of your life. What would it be? But also, why is your reasoning? Go with Joe.
Is this like just normal real life? Like there's still the same consequences and whatnot?
Yes. Yes.
All of the positives will just be higher than
well, I was going to say, like, well, if I could just exist on opiates forever with no consequence every single day, fantastic. I'm taking that option.
Would you believe me if I said I don't like how opiates make me feel?
No, I'd believe you, but I would also say I bet we could attune the protocol.
I have an open mind, Joe. Let's give it a go.
Anyway, I think it's going to have to be MDMA. I think everybody probably has the same response. It's just so fantastic in every single way.
Hands down, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't have to think about it. I also feel like I owe a lot to MDMA because it's no secret that I have complex PTSD, and I feel like I owe a lot to MDMA in helping me revisit and process some really difficult things and move on with my life in a more productive way, and in a way that I really don't think would be possible without it. So just because I feel a loyalty to the drug, I'm going to choose it, but also like it's just objectively the best drug. So yeah, that.
George will go next, and then George can go last. I would say, yeah, I was going to say in my current state and my understanding of how things work and what I enjoy, I would also go with MDMA because it just can't be faulted in, and also there's no uncertainty about what I would get out of it. I think it would be maybe in years to come, if I've had more experiences that have opened myself to different visual fields that I haven't yet experienced with something like a psychedelic, maybe they might be the thing. Because I think the after effects potentially in regards to the fact that once it's done, you don't typically feel a little bit, sometimes if you have too much MDMA, then maybe they might be good. But right now, I don't think I could only live my life with that experience in the absence of missing out on MDMA.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said there.
The reason why I like this question was because I found it a really hard one to answer. There's not much I haven't experienced in life, especially in this space, ranging from the normal ones to the more niche as well. Things like MXC, rhino tranquilizer, stuff like that. I've been to some places, right? Now, a personal favorite would be ketamine, but for what I've seen the most growth out of and benefit in me that I think I would probably then utilize as my one for the rest of my life would be psilocybin, under the grounds that it has helped me drastically through many parts of my life battling with different addictions. I've found some incredible benefit for helping to, like me and Joe spoke about earlier, about rewiring my brain into more positive behaviors and understanding myself a hell of a lot better on an egotistical level, squashing of ego, just growing into a person who wants to have a positive impact on the world. So if I can carry that on, that will be the drug of choice that I would steer with. But DMT is wild, yes.
Okay, there we go. Joe, would you rather never drink? Oh, okay, no, would never have caffeine again or never vape again?
I'm not really much of a caffeine user.
Yeah.
Oh,
So,
no?
I mean, I'd like take a pre-workout because we like get them for free, but like I don't think
Okay.
about caffeine, you know. I'm like an L-theanine junkie, funnily enough.
Oh, yeah?
I use 400 milligrams 3 times a day because I'm a very jittery, anxious, like over obsessive, energetic person anyway, like hypermanic. So I
Okay.
don't need any. I certainly can't drink caffeine without L-theanine, or I go crazy. So
Is this like an ADHD thing or what's
maybe
happening?
I'm completely under. I've never been clinically
Okay.
diagnosed with
Oh,
anything. I need.
okay.
It's
Like
essential for me.
I've just been labelled with the terminology special. This depends who you speak to.
That's me.
All the acronyms.
Yeah.
That's funny. Well, thanks for coming on today, boys. That was, I mean, I hope insightful for people. And for people on the fence, I hope maybe they've got some leads on like what to read or how to make up their mind, or maybe just to have more of an open mind. Please message us, either us individually on Instagram, or the Flex Success page. Check out Joe's Physique Collective app, of course, and tell us if, because of this episode, you've decided to try drugs for the first time. We'd be very curious to hear about your
Please
experience.
don't legally obligate us and tried
Yes.
drugs once, died.
Or, oh God, we take responsibility for all the fun you have, but none for the bad. Asterisk, consult a doctor.
Exactly.
Hashtag.
This is not medical advice.
It's not medical advice. All right, guys. Thanks a bunch for your time and your brains, and we'll speak soon.
Thank you for
Please.
having me, guys.